All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our first screencast. Today's screencast is going to be focusing on the first new piece of information that's part of the Grade 10 course, and that's going to be the Act of Union. So we're going to talk in depth about what led to the Act of Union, who created the Act of Union, and what were the major effects of the Act of Union. So last class, and during our review, we spoke in great detail about what the Patriot rebellions were, what caused them, what the ultimate result of it was. All I really need you to know for right now is that these rebellions were a very big deal. People in Britain, politicians in England, they took notice of these rebellions. And so their primary focus going forward was, how exactly do we avoid another rebellion like this? How do we make sure that this sort of violence and this sort of conflict doesn't happen again in our colonies? Shortly after the conclusion of the rebellions, so you'll remember that most of the leaders of the rebellions were sent into exile. Some of the most high profile were sentenced to death in a sort of public hanging. And shortly after this, the British government sends over this gentleman here. His name is Lord Durham. Lord Durham was sent with the sort of goal of trying to come up with a report. He was sent to basically observe what the Canadian population looked like, what was leading to this friction, to this tension, and what sort of things can the British government put in place to fix these problems going forward. Durham's report basically outlined the fact that the major issue with this colony was the fact that it was made up of two very different people who spoke different languages, who practiced different religions, and who wanted two very different things in terms of politics, right? And he said that rebellions, like the 1837 rebellions, will continue to happen if nothing, or if his suggestions are not taken into account, if nothing is changed. So big picture, what is it that Durham sort of observed, right, is he said these two cultures that exist within Lower Canada can't peacefully coexist. So how do we move forward? His suggestion for moving forward is to work as hard as possible to assimilate the French-Canadian population. That means to make Canada a truly British colony, right? And gradually, over time, eliminate the French-Canadian culture, or at least their ability to make decisions going forward. So he had three main suggestions that were included within the Durham report. Suggestion number one. How do we limit French-Canadian influence? Well, we increase British immigration. We get British people to come to Canada in huge numbers, and gradually, over time, they will outnumber the French Canadians in Lower Canada. When that happens, the French Canadians will be forced to assimilate, will be forced to adopt English institutions, English language, etc. And over time, they will no longer identify as French Canadians. Suggestion number two was to combine the legislative assemblies of Upper and Lower Canada. Basically to take the governments of Upper and Lower Canada and smash them together and create one. Thirdly, Durham suggested the creation of responsible government. We've spoken about responsible government at length, what that means, but at the end of the day, that is what the 1837 rebellions were all about government that represented the people, that was responsible to the people. So Durham suggests, rather logically, that makes sense. We should give them responsible government. That's what caused the rebellions. So at the end of the day, London decides anything that has to do, with big decisions like this, it isn't Canada's decision. So this all has to do with London. So Lord Durham presents the Durham report to the Parliament in London, and they decide that those first two suggestions that he had, these two here, These are fantastic suggestions. However, the third one, the idea of giving the people responsible government, was seen as too risky after the rebellion. There was a worry that giving the people responsible government would lead to the English population to lose power very, very quickly. So the Act of Union of 1840. The Act of Union of 1840 is what came about, what the British government decided to do and put into law based on the Durham Report. So this is the law. This was what actually was put into place. So the Act of Union looked at changing the economic, territorial, and linguistic makeup of Upper and Lower Canada. So how does the colony make money? How is it organized territorially? And what sort of languages are we speaking in the colony, right? So again, Lord Durham saw the problem as two distinct peoples living in this colony, and the solution to it was to assimilate the French-Canadian peoples, to make it so the French-Canadian peoples would have to adopt the English way of life. Right. So territorially, what happened? In terms of territory, Upper and Lower Canada, which were created with the Constitutional Act of 1791, you'll remember that. The solution is we are now going to smash these things together. So they combined Upper and Lower Canada into a single colony. So you'll look now, the province of Canada here in yellow is now one single territorial unit. Okay, so the province of Canada is what we'll refer the colony by now. So either the province of Canada or a united Canada. In terms of economics, this was really controversial. The Act of Union actually combined the debt of Upper and Lower Canada. So what that means is all the money that was owed by Upper Canada or Lower Canada, whether that be to Great Britain, whether that be to individual companies, debt, right? Debt is the amount of money that you owe to somebody. The Act of Union combined the debts of Upper and Lower Canada, which seems to make sense, but the problem is the problem for the people of Lower Canada is Upper Canada's debt. So think Ontario, English Canada. Their debt, so how much money they owed, was nearly 10 times as large as that of Lower Canada. This isn't super fair. Because when you think about it, the Lower Canadian people were responsible when it came to their own finances. Why should they have to pay back money that they didn't spend? In terms of the political landscape, this is potentially the most important part of the Act of Union. Okay, so this newly formed province of Canada that we've been talking about, right? It is separated. It combines Upper Canada and Lower Canada's legislative assemblies. Okay, so previously they each had a separate legislative assembly. Now they will be combined. They will be one assembly. So when the elections happen, right, there will be one big body, one big legislative assembly. More so than that, there will be equal representation of Canada East and Canada West, or Upper and Lower Canada. So there'll be 42 representatives from what was Lower Canada previously. So 42 representatives from Quebec or Lower Canada or Canada East, and 42 representatives from Canada West or Ontario. This is sort of unfair in the sense that Lower Canada had a significantly larger population at the time. So you can tell that this Act of Union, its real goal is to try to limit the amount of power that French Canadians have in a united Canada. So again, these are the major problems with that political sort of rejigging. So the population of Lower Canada was significantly larger than that of Upper Canada at that time. So this equal split was another attempt to try to limit the amount of power that French Canadians have. Also, secondly, English was going to be the only official language in this new assembly. So you can imagine being someone who only speaks French. If you are elected into this new assembly, you're forced to speak in English. So even though Like, it's pretty much close to half. 35 to 40, maybe 45% of all of Canada's population is French, and yet the only official language remains English. So if we're going to recap the Act of Union, right? So Lower Canada, specifically French Canadians within this region, saw their influence decrease dramatically. So while they had consistently been a majority in Lower Canada and were able to push for their rights, they were now cast into a corner politically. The last thing I want to talk about is just that fact, that sentence that I just said, right? So when you think about what the Legislative Assembly looked like in Lower Canada. So in Lower Canada, when they had elections, the French Canadians would consistently win majorities. Okay, what that means is when they had a vote in this assembly here, the will of what the French Canadians wanted would pass, because when they have elections, most of this assembly would have been French Canadian. However, when you put together the Lower Canadian Assembly and the Upper Canadian Assembly, now the French Canadians only make up a minority of the population. If they make up a minority of the population and a minority of the assembly, it means what they want politically when votes happen are not passing anymore. Because within this larger assembly, if we have Lower Canada with a population of maybe 80% French Canadian, and Upper Canada, which is maybe 5% French Canadian at most, when you combine the two assemblies together, now maybe French Canadians make up 30% of the population, and English Canadians would make up the remaining 70%. So the Act of Union in a nutshell is an attempt by Britain to try to avoid conflict like this in the future, try to avoid another rebellion. How do we do this? We eliminate French Canadian culture, or at the very least, their ability to make decisions in the government.